Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar, One Health from Soil to Society, which is organised by Devonish Nutrition, Macra na Firma, CEJA, and the Lighthouse Farms Network in Wageningen University. My name is Lorcan Allen. I'm the agribusiness editor of the Irish Farmers Journal newspaper in Ireland, and I'll be chairing this morning's webinar, and I'll be guiding us through the proceedings of today's event. As you can tell from this morning's webinar, we're going to try and cover a lot of ground, everything from soil to society and health for in between as well. Just to start, I think I want to go over some housekeeping rules for all of you joining in from whatever part of Europe, be it from Ireland or the UK, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, France, wherever you're joining from this morning, very welcome here. So some housekeeping rules for today's webinar. We want you to engage with us and join in the discussion. So there's a chat function on your Zoom, and we'd encourage people to use that chat function if they want to discuss some of the presentations and different things that are going on in this morning's webinar. Also, you can use the chat function if you want to pose questions to any of the panelists at today's event. We will be monitoring the chat function, so if you have any questions in there, we will pick them up and we will try to get them to the panel. If you want to send us a question directly, you can use the questions and answer tool that is on the function on Zoom. And we will pick up those questions. And as I said, again, we will try and put your questions to the panelists this morning. For social media purposes, if you're going to be tweeting or any social media today, the hashtag we're using is One Health. So we would encourage you to use that as well if you're going to be tweeting as well and get a good discussion going. Now, to start this morning's proceedings, if I could introduce Thomas Duffy, who is president of Macra na Firma here in Ireland, to give a welcoming opening address. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lorcan. I think everyone can hear me there okay. So I'd just like to start by saying, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, fellow members of CEJA, CEJA President and Minister, you're very welcome here today. It's an honour to welcome you virtually here today to what is our replacement for our normal annual conference, which will be one of our major events in the year. I would like to thank Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity, Pippa Hackett, for taking the time to be here today, and our partners in Devonish Nutrition and CEJA for putting this event together with us. This conference comes at an important time, both in terms of agriculture, relationship with the public, but also with legislature. Right now, a new CAP is being negotiated with some significant changes and ambitions. However, all changes and environmental ambitions will ultimately fail if not underpinned by real support for generational renewal. We must see increased ambition in this area, and that means at least the 4% proposed by the European Parliament of the national envelope should be going directly to young farmers, all young farmers. The conversation around agriculture and the environment is often seen as opposing bodies, farmers versus environmentalists. However, the reality is that it is farmers who will suffer climate impacts first and have the biggest stake in action. The models are clear. In a warming Ireland, we will get wetter winters with more flooding and increased rate of drought in summer. Something unthinkable only a few years ago to be talking about irrigation in Ireland. The aim of increased climate resilience and action is in focus at the moment. But these actions must be pragmatic and not offshore biodiversity loss or limit our ability to cope. Already analysis of the farm to fork strategy shows that there are real risks of exactly that happening. Fertilizer and pesticide reductions can be achieved by targeting uptake of good practices, precision agriculture, clover swords. But even here we see contradictions. This year in Ireland, we lost the only clover safe spray that farmers have for reducing nitrogen use. These obstacles must be addressed. Finally, as I stated at the beginning, so I will finish. If we hope to see any change, first we must install young farmers with the education and empower them to make real change. So I look forward to the conference today and the interactions, and I hope we'll get a lot from the Q&As as the day goes through. Thank you.
Minister, I think we're going to just hear a few words now from Pippa Hackett, who is the Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity in Ireland. Minister, you're very welcome. If you could give us a few opening remarks, please.
I will indeed. Thanks, Lorcan, and thanks to Thomas also for his opening comments. Look, I think this conference today is excellent. I think the One Health focus is really important. I think the more farmers and indeed policymakers who understand the link between soil health, between ecology, between growing healthy food and producing healthy food and human health, the better. I think that connection probably isn't widely known, but it's hugely important going forward. So I'm delighted to see that the conference is covering this. I hope the participants get a great deal out of it. And look, it's an honour to be here to help open it and to have a chat with you now, Lorcan, about different issues. So I'm pleased to hand it back to you, and we can get started.
Thank you very much, Minister. So we're going to have a quick chat with Thomas Duffy, President of MACRA, and Minister Pippa Hackett. Minister, if I could start with you as the policymaker here today. There's obviously a lot of change going on at the moment in terms of European, both at a national and European level, in terms of our farming policy. And I mean, in terms of climate action and getting farmers, how do we encourage farmers to take more climate action in what they do on their farms? Because right up to now, I suppose the CAP has penalised farmers in many ways for trying to make climate action. As a policymaker, what are the changes you think we need to see?
Well, I suppose at the moment we have quite a few incentives there already to enable farmers to do more for climate action and indeed biodiversity support in their farm, be that through, even simple measures in a way like planting trees through the forestry programme, we support that. And through the Pillar 2 schemes, GLAS, BDGP, even organic farming, they all play their role in helping farmers to address those. My department also, in addition, supports 23 locally led EIP schemes across the country, and these are really, I think, really important schemes that get farmers working together collectively in areas, working with the natural environment to bring about sustainable solutions to problems and also deliver for climate action. I certainly acknowledge the frustration that exists in relation to penalising farmers for biodiversity measures. As Thomas indicated in his opening statements, the CAP strategic plan is currently being discussed, and I'm sure this will be one of the many aspects to come up.
Okay. And like from what I see, I think farming is starting to change. I think there's a much more focus on environmental and biodiversity outcomes on farming, and rightly so, we're headed that direction. But change takes time, and how do we communicate as farmers to people who want to see dramatic change, that this doesn't happen overnight when it comes to a biological entity like a farm where change is slow? Is that a challenge, I think, for the sector, because it will take time?
Look, I agree, and I don't think anyone does expect change to happen overnight. But I think what people expect and want to see is that ambition to embrace a change and different practices on their farms. And look, it is happening, as you say. Change is happening. Farmers are adopting a variety of different practices, and I think there's broad acceptance among the farming community that change is necessary, not only to address climate action, but indeed biodiversity decline. I suppose the difficulty is how to implement the change in a socially and economically acceptable way. And while we have made sizable efficiency improvements, in fertilizer use or indeed breeding programs, unfortunately the fact remains that environmental quality is declining, and we need to address that, and farmers know that. And I would hope, again, through my department and work with farmers across the country, that we can, help farmers to make, adopt better practices, make better decisions that support, wildlife, deal with emissions, and also, improve the profitability of their farms. I think it can be done. I think we have ideas how to do it. It probably just needs a bit of courage from farmers. It needs support from industry and consumers, and indeed the political will among those who we elect to represent us.
Thomas Duffy, if I could come to you, President of Macra na Feirme, the Young Farmers Association in Ireland. You speak with young farmers in Ireland regularly, and you, through your role as president, you engage with young farmers all across Europe. Do you think farming is seen still as an attractive career path for young farmers, or will the sector struggle to attract new people, that generational renewal into the sector, when there's so much negativity it feels about agriculture at the minute in terms of its impact on the environment and biodiversity and the emissions? What's your views on that?
Yeah, so I suppose first, it definitely can be seen as an attractive, and both an attractive way of life, but also an attractive career and profession. Agriculture has a couple of elements which really are very hard to find in any other industry. Number one, you're generally your own boss. You're able to make your own decisions. You're able to implement whatever practices that you want to see. And that's one of the really big attractions on agriculture. Now, obviously, that's within the restrictions and in some cases appropriately, in some cases not, of regulation to try and protect the general both the environment and the general public health. And that's right, that some of those restrictions are in place. And as I say, some of them need to be improved. Minister Hackett has alluded to some of those. In terms of I suppose the attention being paid to agriculture at the moment from its role in the environment, would that discourage farmers from getting involved in farming? No, I don't think so. I don't think that for young people growing up on farms, I don't think that would be a significant influence whether they go farming or not. There are much larger obstacles. First and foremost, there are the obstacles of actually the price of land, access to land, access to credit. Those are the two largest areas which young farmers struggle with. Succession planning then is a major issue. We've moved away from an inheritance model in most farms towards a partnership model, and that has been really positive for both the older generation and the younger generation. But again, it's not moving fast enough. We're not seeing that embraced quick enough to really give young farmers the potential. Then low returns from the market are probably the single largest driver away from certain sectors. Like we see, there is not an equal distribution of the age profile between dairy and beef and sheep and tillage. The Teagasc sustainability report is actually excellent. It's one of the first times that we've really been able to look at those figures in detail. And we see that there are more young people getting into dairy and there are less young people taking over beef and sheep farming, partially because of low returns, partially due to fragmentation, particularly in the Northwest. And we're trying to, I suppose, achieve and address that with our land mobility service, which is like a matchmaking service, essentially, not to trivialize it too much, that helps young farmers get access to land that they wouldn't otherwise. In terms of the negative bias towards agriculture, online particularly, but also in some media outlets, is that having an impact? Yes, it's 100% having an impact. The biggest impact it's having is discouraging young people and people in general from talking about agriculture and the positives they're having. If you are putting yourself up there to get abuse, to get trolling, and very often to suffer coordinated campaigns against you, you are not going to want to spread the good messages of what farmers are doing, the actions that farmers are doing. And the problem is then the consumer and the general public are not seeing those good actions. And so they're only seeing the negative messages, which is amplifying the problem.
Okay, very interesting. Thomas, as a farmer yourself, and someone who's obviously engaged in trying to influence policy, there's an awful lot of change happening right now, both in Ireland and at a European level, as I said, in terms of agricultural policy, be it environmental or biodiversity or climate change. What, in your view, do you think we're getting right that makes sense for farmers, and what do you think you're getting wrong? Because I thought it was very interesting your comments about the spray the clover-friendly spray has been banned now that would have actually helped reduce nitrogen use on farms. What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong in your view?
I think what we're doing right is there's a general better recognition for the complexity of the agricultural system. There are, one of the things that we're doing very well in Ireland is in terms of research. We both have Teagasc, but we also have UCD, UCC. We're doing amazing research throughout the entire country and giving farmers a lot of different options in terms of what they're doing. The problem then on the flip side is that's not getting recognised, particularly at an EU level, of the diversity. We look at the farm to fork strategy, there's no recognition of some of the moves that farmers are doing that are actively reducing no recognition of minimum tillage, there's no recognition of nitrogen fixing crops. We still in Europe have a serious problem with a dependency on protein imports from outside the EU. And this is a recognized issue. We have the protein subsidy top up, one of the coupled payments, which is great, but ultimately there's still not enough going on because we're competing with cheap imports. So we have a duality. I think there is more of a focus on farmers, and there is an attempt to support farmers in doing that, certainly in becoming more environmentally friendly. But if you do that in a marketplace where those farmers are being undercut by the absolute lowest standard of food, and we're doing trade deals like the one that was proposed with the Mercosur countries. And then inside of, I think there's a lack of joined up thinking in general. So again, to go back to that example, Lurkin, and it's far from the only one. I mean, the tillage sector is suffering this all the time. When we look at that, simultaneously, derogation farms are required now to put in clover into their swords and their reseeding. Brilliant, 100% right. We've been doing it here on the farm since time immemorial. You know, it's really common practice. But the problem is, because of the rules around the licensing of product, we're now not able to access a product which allows weed control in that new sward, which means that clover is very likely going to get killed out when we try to control the weeds coming up in the second round. Or we have to return to a more intensive form of cultivation, like deep ploughing, which is something that farmers are trying to avoid doing in order to control weeds better. So it's a very difficult, it's really a lack of joined up thinking. We need to see, set down, okay, this is the strategy ultimately of where we want agriculture to go. Here's how it'll fit in the market. Here's where the places are most appropriate. And also look at the EU as a whole, not just Ireland versus Spain or versus France. We are all part of the one trading bloc. We are member states in the union. So it may be more appropriate for one product to be produced in one place and more appropriate for another product to be produced in another place, depending on where the climate, depending on the traditional practices in those areas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Minister Hackett, if I could come back to you, you yourself are a farmer, which I think is a really positive thing that we have a farmer actually in politics and influencing policy. From your perspective, like, how do we, we always hear how there's a bridging gap between the consumer and the farmer, and it has happened consistently in many countries over years. How do we kind of bring it back to the consumer to show them the importance of where their food comes from, how it's produced, and its impact on their health? Because this conference is called One Health from Soil to Society, so I want to be keeping with that theme today. So, what's your views on how we improve in that area?
Well, I think a lot of it, again, we talk about communication and getting that message, from farm to fork to the consumer. I mean, there are a lot of consumers out there who are, very sort of conscious about the food they eat, but they might not know where the food comes from. And I'm a great supporter of locally produced food, and I think within Ireland, even within a domestic market, there's great scope there for Irish consumers to eat more Irish produced food. And I think, there's a lot of consumers there who might believe they've got a very healthy diet, but maybe when you look at perhaps the carbon footprint or indeed the biodiversity footprint, if you like, of the food they eat, they mightn't be aware of that. So again, I think we have to sort of really, within our own boundaries, we can focus very much on our own consumers, and we have to do everything we can to educate those at the first instance. We rely, to educate consumers in different countries with our exports is probably a different message, and we will rely on the expertise in Board B and so forth to sell that. But I think it is ever important. I mean, when you hear figures that we're only spending sort of 9% of our disposable income on food now, in Ireland, compared to what it was, a couple of generations ago. I mean, it's a staggering decline in how we value food. And I think that is a race to the bottom that we really have to get away from. And we need to work really hard to do that. I appreciate, as an export nation, we've less influence over consumers in other countries, but I mean, at least let's try working on our own consumers here, and you know, absolutely feed them the best we can. The connection with human health, as indicated in this conference, is so close, and environmental health and human health, I mean, it is essentially all wrapped into the one thing, and farming and our farmers have a huge role to play in that. And you know, it'd be great to see that connection much more strongly between farmers and consumers.
Okay, no, fully agree, Minister. We'll leave it there for now, and we'll move on to the next. Just thank you for your contributions, Colin Stuffy, President of Macra na Feirme, and Pippa Hackett, Minister of State for Land Use and Biodiversity. Thank you very much this morning for your contributions to the conference.
Thanks, Lorcan.
Thanks, sir.
You're very welcome. Folks, okay, we're going to move on to the next part of our conference. Our next speaker is Henk Westhoek, who is a policy officer in DG Sante, which is the health agency, essentially, of the European Commission, which has actually been given charge of implementing the European Union's much publicized farm to fork strategy over the coming decades. Henk works with the Commission as a national seconded expert. He's a Dutch national, and Henk is going to give us a presentation from what farm to fork means from his perspective in DG Sante. Henk, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to present here. Let me check how to remove the echo. Okay, sorry for that, but it's now better. Yeah, there we are. Well, the Farm to Fork strategy is part of the European Green Deal, as you all probably know. The Green Deal consists of a number of strategies. Biodiversity strategy is one of those, and the Farm to Fork strategy is another important strategy of the European Green Deal. And the Farm to Fork strategy tries to address a number of issues in the European society, which have already been addressed by the previous speakers to a large extent, and try to address those in an integrated way. And I think it's very important and very good that this strategy is much broader than just the issue of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but it also focuses on biodiversity, on the environmental side, but also to reduce it tries to address the food waste and loss issue, and to try to achieve a circular bio-based economy. But it's much more than environmental sustainability. It's also social sustainability. It's aiming at healthier diets and to reduce overweight. Well, we know that in Europe, almost half of the adult population is overweight or obese, so there's really a health issue. And especially now in this COVID times, you see that especially people suffering from already a health issue are more vulnerable for the COVID effects. So this really is a big issue, and we know that currently in Europe that food consumption patterns are both unsustainable from the health perspective as well as from the environmental perspective, and that the average intake of energy, red meat, sugars, salt and fat is too low, and that is too high, and that the consumption of whole grain cereals, fruits and vegetables, legume and nuts is too low. So this is one of the other things the strategy tries to address. Also, it tries to improve animal welfare. Of course, food affordability has to be in order, especially for poorer people in societies within Europe. And also the improvement of social rights of workers in the food chain is an important aspect. And finally, last but not least, but of course also economic sustainability is a key aspect of the strategy. So fairer incomes for farmers is an important aspect, just transition, and also new business and job opportunities. So it's really a very broad strategy, not just focusing on greenhouse gas emissions at the farmer stage, but really a very broad strategy, and also trying to overcome this this seemingly contrast between environment and farming. Of course, farmers also are in favor of a good environment, and they are depending, as has been stressed already, depending on a good environment to produce crops and livestock. And the second new thing about the strategy is it tries to have an integrated approach. So not only, it tries to involve all actors in the food chain, from the input industry, farmers, processors, food manufacturers, and retailers, up to consumers and citizens. So it's not only addressing farmers again, but it's addressing the whole food sector. And not only the food chain in a narrow sense, but also tries to involve advisory services, research, but also policy at various levels. So in the end, we need different levels of governance and multiple instruments to achieve those goals. So it's legislation and regulation, but also financial incentives, education, research and innovation, green public procurement, but also voluntary commitments will be probably very important. Well, the Farm to Fork strategy, as you probably all are aware of, has these 4 overarching goals, which is the reduction of 50% of pesticide use, the reduction of nutrient losses by 50%, the reduction of the sales of antimicrobials by 50%, and to achieve at least 25% of EU organic land under organic farming. But I have to say that these goals are, first, they are aspirational goals, or they're not bound by regulation or legislation. These are aspirational goals, and of course also national conditions will be taken into account to see which goals applies to which member states. And it also will, and the goals will also be look, of course, at historic achievements within member states. But like I said, these are by far not the only goals of the Farm to Fork strategy. There are much more goals on the health side, on the environmental side, but also especially on the economic side. Now I come to the different instruments, how to achieve those targets and the objectives of the Farm to Fork strategy. Well, there was one big legislative framework has been announced in the Farm to Fork strategy, which is called the Legislative Framework for Sustainable Food Systems, which will include general principles and requirements for sustainability of food systems. And it also tries to ensure policy coherence at the EU at national level and to mainstream sustainability in foods related policies. And by sustainability, we not only mean environmental sustainability, but also with regards to health and economic and social sustainability. Then more directed to its food production, there are a large number of actions. Of course, one of the most important one is are the national strategic plans, and which you also have to take into account the objectives of the Green Deal. And there will be a revision of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive. There will be new regulations in place to facilitate the plant protection products containing biological active substances. There will come an action plan for the organic sector in order to stimulate the supply and demand for organic products. And there will be an integrated nutrient management plan in order to reduce the pollution from fertilizers. Well, also there will be new legislation regarding animal welfare, and also there's work ongoing already on animal welfare labeling schemes Europe-wide. There will be a proposal for feed additives, also to reduce the dependency of import of proteins. There are now protein sources which cannot be used in the EU, so the research and the policies are being reassessed to see whether there can be new feed sources to reduce this dependency on protein import. There will be also legislative initiatives to enhance the cooperation of primary producers in the food chain. There will be clarification of competition rules with regard to sustainability and collective actions. And finally, there's a proposal to create farm sustainability data network, also to help farmers to be able to benchmark their farms compared to other farms. Well, it's called From Farm to Fork, but fishery is not forgotten. I will not mention all the actions, but there are a number of actions also aimed at sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. Then there are quite some actions regarding what we call the middle part of the food chain, because we know they have a huge influence on what's happening on one hand on farm scales and fishermen. So how can these actors enable farmers and reward farmers to do more, for example, on animal welfare or environmental protection. But also we know that the same actors like food companies and retailers have a big influence on consumption patterns of consumers. So the general idea is to make healthy and sustainable choices the easy choice for consumers. Well, and able to do so, we are busy already to develop a code and monitoring framework for responsible business and marketing conduct in the food supply chain, which is really one of the centerpieces, excuse me, of the Farm to Fork strategy. And we're also working on other issues like reformulation of food products, setting nutrient profiles, and also working on marketing standards. Then there will be a number of actions geared at the shift towards healthy and sustainable diets, mainly by better informing consumers about the health impacts of certain products, but also on the environmental impacts. And there's also a proposal on the table to adjust VAT rates to allow member states to make a more targeted use of those rates. Then there are a number of actions to reduce food waste and losses, which of course still 20% of the food is being wasted now in Europe between farm and fork. So there's a lot of work already going on, but we try to even reinforce this work to reduce reduce food waste and food losses at all stages in the food system. Then the Commission will support all this action by an ambitious research program. So there is 10 billion euros foreseen for the Horizon Europe program on food and agriculture. And in relation to that, there is a partnership program called IEP Agri. There are regional development funds. There will be investments in fast broadband, in internet in rural areas, also to support precision farming and other innovative techniques. And also the member states are asked to intensify the efforts on advisory service to enable farmers to adopt more sustainable production practices. And also on the international side, the Commission is working to promote a global transition, for example, by supporting developing countries in their transition to a sustainable food system, but also in trade agreements. There will be an ambitious sustainability chapter on food. And also in labeling schemes, of course, they should be international acknowledged. As a Commission, we think that there are a lot of benefits and opportunities for all actors in the food system. So we really see that the Farm to Fork strategy, if carried out well and with support of member states, but of all actors in the food system, that it can really be a win-win-win for all. I mean, it's not about only just setting higher standards for farmers, but it is also rewarding farmers better for all the efforts they're undertaking to produce safe and healthy food, but also to reward them as in their role as stewards of natural resources and the natural environment. So there's a win for farmers, there's a win for consumers in terms of healthier and more sustainable diets. There will be a win in terms of more sustainable business opportunities, and also a win at a global scale to contribute to the global transition towards global sustainable food systems. Just like I said, this requires a collective approach, and it also requires a dialogue with all actors in the food system, including consumers and citizens, because like has been previously said already, sometimes this dialogue is lacking. So in this sense, it's very important to start this dialogue and to have all actors around the table and to try to achieve this, this transition in an inclusive way. So finally, to make the Farm to Fork strategy a real success, it will require cooperation of many. So for healthy people and a healthy society, it's really down to us to make it work. It will not work from just by talking from Brussels, but it has to be done, of course, on the ground. So it will need the involvement of many actors on the ground. So it's down to us to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henk, for that really detailed and very interesting overview of the EU's Farm to Fork plan as part of the Green Deal. Henk will be joining us on a panel in a few moments' time where we will be putting a number of questions to him. And so if you have any questions about the Farm to Fork strategy or what the EU's plans are, please send them in to us via the Q&A button or in the chat. And remember, if you're on social media, to use the hashtag #OneHealth. Now we're going to go to Professor Alice Stanton, who is a clinician scientist. She's currently professor in cardiovascular pharmacology at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and she also serves as Director of Human Health at Devenish Nutrition. Alice, you're very welcome, and over to you now for your presentation this morning.
Good morning. Minister Hackett, Lurkin, Thomas, Young Farmers of Europe, and all those listening in. I'm very pleased to discuss with you this morning the very important topic, animal source foods and human health. The world is facing a triple health burden related to malnutrition. And with the world's population set to grow to almost 10 billion by 2050, this situation is going to worsen. The challenge of the 21st century is to nourish 10 billion world population with nourishing food produced sustainably. The Eat Lancet Commission in 2019 suggested one possible solution. Their reference diet entails a moving from the panel on the left-hand side, which is the Eat Well Guide, which is in keeping with most national and international nutritional guides, and moving to the panel on the right-hand side. This would involve a doubling of intake of fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, and a halving of meat and dairy intakes, and a 90% reduction in red meat consumption. This resulted in multiple headlines in our newspapers during 2019. Now, the dramatic reduction in red meat consumption that was advised by the reference diet, it was due to concerns about greenhouse gas emissions by livestock farming. Let's look at the impact of dietary factors on deaths and disease burden. Disease burden may be quantified in terms of disability adjusted life years. And that's a measure of how much misery people are living with in the world due to various diseases. The left-hand panel shows the deaths that result from excess consumption of various nutrients and deficient intake of various nutrients on deaths. The right-hand panel shows the effects on disease burden. Dietary risks are very, very important. They account for 22 million deaths per year and 955 million DALYs each year. However, less than 0.2% of those deaths and DALYs are related to excessive red meat intake. This has been confirmed by another publication in 2019. This is a series of publications that were published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in October of 2019. 5 systematic reviews were undertaken concerning the risks of eating unprocessed red meat and processed meat. And their findings were conclusive. There was some weak evidence of a small effect on deaths and disease burden from cardiovascular disease, from type 2 diabetes mellitus, and from cancer. But these were very small effects, and they were of borderline statistical significance. Let's look at a really important deficiency: child and maternal malnutrition, including the various micronutrient deficiencies. That's the leading cause of disease burden in the 21st century. It dwarfs diets that are high in red meat or diets that are high in processed meats. Childhood stunting is a consequence of child and maternal malnutrition. Childhood stunting is not just small children. It's poor physical development and poor brain development of children. It results in poor performance in school, poor cognitive ability, less lifetime options, and into a vicious circle of the next generation also being disadvantaged and malnourished. Look at the countries where there's a high prevalence of child stunting, more than 30% in Africa and in countries surrounding India. They are the very countries in the lower left plot who eat the least meat. And in the main plot to the right, you can see that there's an inverse relationship between childhood stunting and annual intake of meat. The more meat that is eaten, the less the childhood stunting. Now that's an association, and there probably are, in fact, indeed, there are many other factors that will impinge on that relationship. But let's look at a gold standard evaluation of the impact of animal source foods on brain development and cognitive function. So this was a randomized controlled study conducted in Kenya, in Kenyan primary school children. They took 12 schools. They randomized those schools, 3 per randomization, to 4 different diets. The first group got a plain vegetable stew in addition to their usual nourishment on a daily basis as they attended school. The next group got the vegetable stew and also milk. The next group got the vegetable stew and additional meat. And the last group was the control group, who got no additional nourishment. In the right-hand panel are the results of the study after 2 years of this nutritional intervention. The students were tested on arithmetic, English, 2 local languages, geography, science, and the arts. And then there was a global score formed. As you can see, those that got the meat, additional meat, scored best after 2 years of additional nourishment. The next group were the milk. Those that got the plain vegetable stew, in fact, their scores relatively declined, and the control group fared worse. These differences resulted in a 20% difference in global scores between the meat group and the control group, a huge impact on cognitive function and on functioning within a school atmosphere. Returning to the really important excessive nutrient risk factors that impact on deaths and disease burden. These are excessive calorie intake or obesity and diets that are high in salt intake. We know that the rise in obesity has paralleled the increase in our intake of ultra-processed foods. Now in the Western world, half of our supermarket trolleys contain 50% of processed and ultra-processed foods, pasta, sauces, mayonnaise, ketchup, crisps, biscuits are all in there. That's an association. Again, we need to look at randomized controlled trials. And this interesting study was published in 2019. They took 20 subjects and they admitted them to a metabolic ward for 4 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, they either ate an ultra-processed diet or an unprocessed diet. And then they transferred over to the alternate diet. After 2 weeks, calorific intake of those on the ultra-processed diet averaged 3,000 calories per day, whereas it was 500 calories less per day for those on the unprocessed diet. Those on the processed diet, their weight increased by 1 kilogram over the 2 weeks. Those that were on the unprocessed diet, their weight dropped. It dropped down by 1 kilogram. So there was overall a 2 kilogram difference at the end of 2 weeks. Imagine if that continued for years, the difference in weight gain and obesity with eating an ultra-processed diet. Now, if we're going to reduce red meat and animal products, protein considerably, and transfer over to plant-based foods, what's the average person going to eat? Well, what's available now in our shops and supermarkets are burgers, plant-based burgers, and other ultra-processed foods. What's going to happen to the nutrient content of those foods? Well, here is compared the nutritional quality of steak versus plant-based burgers. And you can see very, very similar calories for steak, for Beyond Meat burger, Impossible Burger, very similar fat, saturated fats, carbohydrates, sugars, protein, approximately 20 grams per 100 grams. However, there's a big difference in sodium or salt, 75 milligrams per 115 grams versus 380 versus 430. And look at all of the additives or all of the components in the Beyond Meat burger. These are designed to be an attractive taste and to promote eating more of these products and therefore contribute to further obesity. Other products are even worse. So the jackfruit and mushroom ultra-processed foods typically have even more sugar and salt. So I'm very interested in an alternative solution proposed by the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, which was just published last month. They absolutely recognize that we must produce more nutrient-rich foods from both plant and animal sources, and that these must be produced through sustainable, resilient food systems. And if we're going to do that, we're going to need to measure and optimize both nutritional quality and our carbon footprint. And this slide addresses that, how we should actually quantify that and how we should communicate that to the consumer. In the top right-hand panel, what we're looking at is on the horizontal axis, the mean greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of food. And it looks at sugars, grains, milk and dairy products, meat and meat products, and processed fruit and vegetables. And you can see here, when we look at on a weight basis, yes, meat and meat products actually produce the most greenhouse gas emissions. However, when we quantify on the horizontal axis in the bottom right panel, panel B, In fact, when we quantify on the basis of greenhouse gas emissions per calorie of food produced, in fact, the processed fruits and vegetables do worse. And sweets actually do best in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But are we really going to recommend lots of sweet consumption and with their deleterious effects on human health? So there's another way of quantifying nutritional quality, such as the nutrient density score for 15 essential nutrients, including vitamins, electrolytes, essential amino acids, and essential fatty acids. This is on the horizontal axis of panel C, the main biggest panel in the slide. And again, greenhouse gas emissions on the vertical axis. Most plant-based foods colored in the red circles don't have much greenhouse gas emissions. They're down in the bottom left quarter, but they're not very nutrient dense. In fact, it's the animal source foods, the meat, the poultry, the fish, the milk that are to the right of this figure and have a greater nutrient density. They do have in parallel an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the same relatively. And look at processed vegetables. This is a veggie burger. Yes, it's nutrient dense because of all the additives, but it actually produces even more greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to measure each product individually for its nutrient density or nutrient quality, and also its greenhouse gas emissions, and for other environmental measures. And then we need to make sure that the nutritional quality of our products are at their best, and we need to reduce their environmental footprint. I'm going to just give you one example of enhancing nutritional quality, and my colleagues later on this morning are going to talk about better environmental sustainability. Omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid deficiency is currently resulting in 1.5 million deaths per year and 33 million DALYs per year. We have a very poor situation whereby only 20% of the world's population take in enough seafood-derived omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, DHA and EPA. Many people don't eat oily fish, and many people aren't getting enough omega-3 through current production practices within aquaculture. So there's an alternative or additional solution. We can enrich commonly eaten foods such as chicken meat and eggs with algae-sourced omega-3s. And we recently conducted a randomized controlled trial whereby 40 subjects ate for 6 months control chicken meat and control eggs. 40 subjects ate omega-3 enriched eggs. 40 subjects ate omega-3 enriched chicken meat, and 40 subjects ate omega-3 enriched chicken meat and the enriched eggs for 6 months. After 6 months, those that ate both enriched foods, their omega-3 index increased by 1.7%. That can be seen in the left lower panel. There was a redistribution of omega-3 index such that there was a 70% reduction in those with a high risk omega-3 index, an omega-3 index less than 4%, in those that ate both enriched foods compared to those that ate both control foods. And diastolic blood pressure dropped by 3 millimeters of mercury. All of those effects are associated with a major impact on cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, and deaths. If we're going to communicate the nutritional benefits of nutritionally dense food, we need to communicate with consumers through front of pack labeling or digitally. And I welcome the Farm to Fork commitment to labeling concerning environmental sustainability and nutrient profiles. However, there appears to be a focus on the disadvantageous excesses. So a focus on sugar, salt, fat, and calories. Really, really important. However, there's no mention of looking at the beneficial nutrients, the nutrient-rich foods that are common deficiencies that we want consumers to increase their intakes of. So here's my first attempt at a front of pack labeling system for beneficial nutrients, such as the long chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. For bioavailable iron, because there's a difference between the heme iron in animal source foods and the elemental iron that comes from plants. Heme iron is 5 times as bioavailable. Likewise, there's a difference in effectiveness of vitamin D3 from animal sources and vitamin D2, which comes from plant sources, by a factor of 5 again. To conclude, if we replace all fresh meat, fish, and dairy with additive-rich, calorie-rich processed foods so as to solve our greenhouse gas emissions, we will have problems with human health. A much better solution is to optimize both the nutritional quality of fresh foods and sustainable agricultural practices. And there absolutely is a greater need for us to communicate with consumers on the health benefits of advantageous nutrients. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation, Alice. Professor Jonathan, if I could come back to you, we're going to have a panel discussion now with Professor Stanton and Henk Westhoek from DG Sante. So if you have any questions for either, please put them in, send them to us either via the chat function or on social media, and we will put them to the panel. Professor Stanton, if I could start with you, you mentioned in your presentation there a different strategy around food nutrition by the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems when it comes to nutrition. Are there differences between that paper and where the Farm to Fork is? Outline some of the differences there for me, please.
Yeah, in fact, they're addressing and coming to a very, very similar conclusion. And that really can be summarized by the Global Panel's report, its title. They want to reach future food systems that are good for the people, our planet, and for prosperity. Both Farm to Fork and the Global Panel strategies are very, very much aligned. Now, the Global Panel report is much more detailed and comprehensive. It's 200 pages long by comparison with the 22 pages of Farm to Fork. So I would anticipate that as we work through the detail of the European strategy for food systems, that actually they will become even more aligned. There does appear at this stage to be some differences in focus. The Global Panel is much more clearly recognizing the triple burden of malnutrition. So obesity, actual hunger, and then hidden hunger, the micronutrient deficiencies. And indeed, micronutrient deficiencies are not confined to the developing world. They are in fact, many people who are overweight and obese because they're eating nutrient-poor foods are actually micronutrient deficient. They're iron deficient, they're vitamin D deficient, they're omega-3 deficient. I think the Global Panel does a much better job of separately quantifying the health effects and the environmental impacts of various foods, so both plant foods and animal source foods. The Farm to Fork actually, probably because it's much briefer, it actually lumps the two together, so there's an element of conflation, and they're not separately quantified, and then looking for the optimization of both aspects. I think there's a win-win situation. I think we can have highly nutritious foods that are all produced entirely sustainably. And I think we'll hear more about that later on this morning. I think the Global Panel's report is much clearer on the dangers to human health of removal of a large amount of animal source foods. Absolutely, they emphasize eating in moderation of all foods. Again, there's a greater emphasis on whole foods versus processed foods within the Global Panel, but I anticipate that that'll come in Farm to Fork. And I think they're clearer about how they're going to communicate to consumers about the benefits of eating whole foods that are nutrient rich, and avoidance of ultra processed foods. So I think they will come together, and there's just some slight differences in emphasis and focus.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much, Alice. Henk, if I could come back to you as representative of the European Commission here in DG Sante. Obviously, the Farm to Fork is trying to strike that balance between sort of defining policy for more sustainable agriculture and what it outlined in terms of sustainable diets. I think when farmers maybe saw the term sustainable diets, there was a bit of worry that it was going to be a sort of a carte blanche proposal to reduce animal source foods dramatically. What's your view in terms of where the Farm to Fork is ultimately headed? Are farmers being too fearful maybe of this term of sustainable diets?
Yes, I think so. Like Alison said, I mean, it's very important to have diverse diets and to do everything in moderation. So it's not about removing meat or red meat, especially from our diets, but in cases, and it might entail a reduction, of course, in consumption of red meat or other products. But of course, the Farm to Fork strategy is not a scientific paper; it's a policy document. But of course, in elaboration of the strategy, we'll work together with scientists to determine what really is a healthy and sustainable diet. And if you look, for example, at the current intake of proteins, if you express this in animal protein and plant protein, then currently about 60% of the average diet is in forms of animal proteins, and about 40% is in terms of plant proteins. So there might be a slight reduction in total intake in the end of animal products, and an increase of plant-based products. But in many cases, it's not necessary, for example, to shift to meat replacers, because like Alison has explained, these have their limitations and in terms of dietary quality and of salt content. And if you look at, for example, the effects on human health, and for certain vulnerable groups, animal products are certainly very favorable and an essential part of the diet. But on the other hand, if you look at the statistics, for example, on meat consumption, there you see that the high consumers of meat are actually adult men between 20 and 65, which could very well do with a reduction of total meat consumption. But like I said, I mean, the Farm to Fork strategy is much broader than just the issue of meat consumption versus plant-based consumption, and and we should do everything in moderation and based on scientific evidence.
Sure. Henk, you mentioned in your presentation the idea that the farm to fork strategy would encourage food producers and retailers to encourage sustainable diets. And I'm just wondering, is there room in there for abuse maybe, because the food industry, like any company, is going to do what's most profitable, I think, for how they're going to make income from consumers. And would you be worried that the food industry will push kind of these less healthy plant-based products, describing them as sustainable, but they might not be as healthy for consumers because there's better profit margins in them for companies?
Well, you're right that this might be a risk, and we have to be aware of this. But of course, it's also correct that in some cases, in much more cases, the desired shifts are not in favor of the food companies. For example, to eat less produced products in processed products in general. So not only meat replacements, but also soft drinks, chips, snacks, etc. So, but they are aware of the issue, and we are and they see that something has to change. But of course, it might be in certain cases difficult for them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Professor Stanton, from your view as someone, a scientist in this area whose expertise in terms of diet, what is a sustainable diet for a European consumer? I mean, I think I've heard you speak before about the idea of the Eat Lancet and how it was very difficult to see how people would ever actually move to that diet when we don't even already eat enough vegetables and fruit and vegetables in our diets. Where are we going wrong, or where do we need to get to in your view?
I'm actually pretty happy with a lot of the national and international guidelines that are currently there, which would such as the Eat Well plate, the Harvard Healthy Eating plate. They would put that, yes, we absolutely are aiming for about 50% of the plate to be fruit and vegetables, and that about a sixth of the plate should be animal source protein or plant source protein, so protein rich and the relevant micronutrient rich foods. There should be dairy in there. In fact, there's a huge study which I didn't have time to present of that from the Pure Group, that's prospective rural and urban prospective study, 130,000 subjects worldwide, and they showed actually a 30% reduction in all cardiovascular events, so heart attacks, strokes, and deaths, if you ate at least 2 portions of dairy per day by comparison with not eating any dairy, worldwide, in developed and underdeveloped countries. So you need a balance. Yes, you need some staples, so grains and cereals, they should be the unprocessed type. They should not be the ultra processed, refined carbohydrates that our diets are far too rich in. At the moment, we're eating 50% of those processed and ultra processed foods. That's not helpful. And I think Henk and I are very much in agreement with that. So that's a healthy diet. If we are going to encourage sustainability, we need to measure the production all along the food chain for sustainability, because it can vary hugely. So meat produced in one way can be very, very sustainable. In another way, it can actually absolutely be contributing to climate crisis. We need to measure both the health-giving properties and the environmental impacts separately, and all food should satisfy both criteria.
And just there's plenty of questions coming in, and I would encourage viewers to keep sending them in. We'll try and get to them as best we can. One question for you, Professor Stanton. You know, why do you think there's, or is there, I suppose, a divide between health experts when it comes to the benefits of red meat and dairy in people's diets?
There's an intense debate going on in academic circles, some squabbling. I think the health benefits are being mixed up with the environmental impacts and with animal welfare. And absolutely, all three need to be looked after. The deleterious health effects of red meat comes from excesses. So eating red meat daily is absolutely not a good idea. And probably in actual fact, you certainly would get enough nutrients from eating it 3 times weekly. And in fact, our Irish guidelines for 1 to 4-year-olds, just published 2 months ago, said actually, you need to eat red meat, or you need to provide for our youth red meat 3 times a week. And if you're not doing that, you must provide iron supplements, because otherwise your child will be iron deficient, and that will impair, not only cause anemia, but in fact iron is really important for the developing brain. So that's partly why the Kenyan school children benefited from the additional meat that they got in their diet. So I think it's mixed up between environmental impacts, animal welfare, and health effects, and I think they should be looked at separately, and all should be optimized.
Henk, if I could come back to you on the wider farm to fork strategy, and some of the, as you said, it's you know, it's not legislatively or legally binding sort of targets, but it's an ambition of the European Union to move in this direction. And there's been, in the last couple of weeks, I've seen a couple of papers from scientific journals and from the US Department of Agriculture sort of analyzing the farm to fork strategy and what impact it could have on global agriculture production, global trade, and things like that. For instance, the USDA saying that a move to farm to fork with, you know, the reduction in output from Europe because of some of the reductions in inputs would move 22 million people potentially into hunger around the world outside of Europe. And also the scientific journal Nature saying that, you know, kind of saying that is the European Union trying to offshore its environmental damage. How do you respond to that? I mean, what's the view on that?
Well, if I'm aware, there's a official response from the European Commission on this USDA paper, but in short, two things to emphasize. First of all, is that the USDA paper did not take into account all the actions the Commission has taken and all the member states will take to reduce environmental impact while keeping yields at the same level, or more or less at the same level, by enhancing, promoting sustainable agriculture, by promoting precision techniques. So by all kinds of smart technology, you can reduce the use of pesticides and nutrients while not reducing crop yields. And this is not taken into account in the USDA study. And another thing is that's like we're discussing here, that's the farm to fork is also addressing food waste and food losses. Is addressing more sustainable diets. And in combination, this could also reduce the demand for food within the EU. And they did not have taken this into account. And this is a very important thing also in connection to what's previously said about the highly processed foods, well, sugary drinks like snacks, like white bread, etc. too much fat consumption. Well, in all cases, it means that we take out the valuable proteins and the valuable minerals and fibers from the food chain, and we transfer them into feed instead of eating it ourselves. So in that sense, you could also have, by changing consumption patterns, you need less production, because if you would shift to a whole food diets, then you would have better advantage of all the products being consumed. So it's certainly not the intention of the Farm to Fork strategy to have some kind of greenwashing of European agriculture and then importing more, but it should be in balance. So, and this can be achieved, like I said, one way by technology on the production level, but also by taking the consumption level into account.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there's a risk that that could happen in terms of our imports actually increasing?
Well, like I tried to explain, if you only would look at the production side measures, there might be a risk, but on the other hand, we try to do the reduction side measures in a smart way, and we also try to address consumption at the same point. So if you combine those two, there is no risk of having higher imports. Mm-hmm. And like I said, we're also looking into feed alternatives, alternative feed sources, like, for example, processed animal proteins, but also innovative feed sources. So these also could replace imports.
Mm-hmm. Professor Stanton, if I can go back to you, just a couple of questions that came in. Firstly, just can you give a comment on the bioavailability of omega-3 fatty acids? I mean, what's the difference between people taking supplements for this along with their current diet? And also just a question about clarifying just replacing meat and dairy for processed calorie-rich food. You said that if you replace them, we'll have health problems. Is that because the sort of veggie or highly processed veggie products are high in fat or high in sodium and salt? You might go through that.
Yeah, two quite different questions. Yeah, I mean, people say actually it doesn't matter if you don't eat oily fish, and it doesn't matter that current farmed salmon, the amount of omega-3 that has been contained within the farmed salmon has dropped by at least 50% in most farmed salmon over the last 15 years. That's because, in fact, salmon don't make DHA and EPA, which are the long chain, very valuable omega-3s. They have to be fed it in their feed, and they're usually fed it from the waste products of the wild fish catch. But that's, with the rise in aquaculture, and that's now a scarce and expensive resource. So less is being fed, so there's much less in farmed salmon. Could we just do it with omega-3 supplements? Unfortunately, omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids are very unstable, and the over-the-counter omega-3 supplements have been shown to actually be a high percentage is actually oxidized, and the oxidized omega-3s actually antagonize the beneficial effects of the intact molecule. There's issues of bioavailability as well when you take it as an oily capsule rather than as part of a whole food, such as in high quality fish, such as salmon and mackerel, or in the recently innovated omega-3 enriched chicken meat and eggs, because it's the algae that are fed to the chickens. They're integrated within the meat and within the eggs, and they're protected from oxidation. So, and I think the last thing is on supplements. Who takes supplements? Will the more disadvantaged members of our societies actually regularly take the iron and omega-3 supplements that will be needed to replace high quality food? So it's quite often the worried well that take supplements. Yeah, absolutely. If it'd be great if people ate the bean and legume rich stews every day in replacement of eating steak and drinking milk in order to provide the a balanced amino acid and protein intake. But actually, that's not the way the world works now. People are going to look for convenience foods. They want something that they can cook quickly when they come in from work and get it onto the table. So if we switch from whole dairy products and whole meat products, it is going to be, for many of our society, they're going to switch over to the ultra-processed plant-derived foods, which are, as I've shown, currently highly rich in salt and sugar, and
okay.
much less protein.
Yeah. Henk, if I could come back to you, you mentioned in your presentation as well, another element of the farm to fork strategy is this idea of front of labeling or front of pack labeling in terms of nutrition value of the food, but also the sort of climate or environmental impact of that food. Can you give us a little bit more detail about how that's going to work? Because it just feels like that's going to be a minefield of an area for policymakers or people like yourselves to actually implement a strategy in that area that people are actually all going to agree on. There's going to be a lot of differing views there on what will entail a sustainable label on food.
Yes, that's correct. That's not an easy part of the farm to fork strategy. We are further with the front of label packaging. There's a report from the Commission on different models which have been applied by member states, because there are already a number of member states which have front of package labeling on the for nutrition. So they are a little bit further advanced, but for sustainability, we still have to do a lot of work. But on the other hand, consumers are now very often confused because there are already a wide range of labels on packages, and well, I know in the Netherlands there are about 40, 50 different labels you can find on food packages claiming various aspects regarding animal welfare or the environment or whatever aspect. So that's very difficult for consumers to see the trees from the forest. So there's some harmonization and some sanitation of what's currently on the market might help. So this is only meant to help consumers to have to make better informed choices.
Alice, what's your view on this idea of front of labeling or front of pack labeling in terms of a sustainable food product?
I agree with Henk that it's going to be a challenge. I wouldn't be. I think sustainability is going to be a challenge because there's multiple aspects to it. I welcome that it actually is going to be separately labelled for sustainability and for nutritional quality. The currently available nutrient quality labels really do emphasize the disadvantageous nutrients. I'm not seeing enough of the advertising the benefits of high quality food. And in large part, they apply to packaged food, which is the processed foods. So we're not actually getting the message across of the positives of whole foods. So I think we need to work on that. I think that can be done without increased packaging. I think we'll be doing it digitally. But I would very much want the beneficial nutrients to be celebrated.
Okay, folks, we're just approaching our coffee break here now, so I'm going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank both my guests from this morning, from this panel, Henk Westhoek of DG Sante, who really gave us an excellent overview of Farm to Fork and its ambitions, and Professor Alice Stanton, Professor in Cardiovascular Pharmacology in the Royal College of Surgeons and also Director of Human Health at Devenish Nutrition. Thank you both for joining us this morning. We're going to take a 10-minute coffee break now, so if people would like to go and grab a quick coffee, and we'll be back here in 10 minutes and it's time to kick off the second half of our this morning's webinar, One Health from Soil Society. Thanks for staying with us. Hi everyone, and welcome back to this morning's webinar, One Health from Soil to Society, brought to you this morning by Macra na Feirme, the Irish Young Farmers Association, also in Macra Agricultural Skillnet, CJ Young Farmers Association in Europe, Devenish Nutrition, and the Lighthouse Farms network in Wageningen University in the Netherlands. We're going to kick off the second part of this morning's webinar with a short video now, kind of giving you a highlight of the Global Innovation Centre and Research Farm run by Devenish Nutrition at their lands at Doubt in County Meath here in Ireland, which is a really interesting place. You'll enjoy this video. Thanks very much.
Devenish is a farming and food company with a focus on agriculture and a focus within that on innovation, doing things differently, and in particular, doing things sustainably. We capture our ideas on sustainable farming and food systems in the strategic focus One Health, from soil to society. And by One Health, we mean plant, animal, human, and environmental health taken together, considered as one. The thinking behind establishing a global centre is the business has become itself global. We do something now in over 50 countries. That imposes a need to do things differently. And one of the things that becomes more and more important is the control and organisation of our intellectual property. So we've decided to house our intellectual property at Netterville Institute in Doubt in County Meath. We have very, very many research partners. What we tend to do is we seek out people, institutions, companies who have an expertise in areas that we are interested in to form partnerships that are focused on solving a problem together or exploiting a technology, a technique or knowledge more widely or for a different purpose.
We do have a health crisis here in Ireland and also worldwide because of eating unhealthy foods. We have almost 1 billion people who are underfed, who go to bed hungry. However, we have a further 2 billion who are actually overfed, who are overweight or obese. Most of those are micronutrient deficient because they eat calorie-rich, sugar, salt-rich diets which lack the essential vitamins, minerals, and essential oils such as omega-3 fatty acids. At Devenish, we believe that we can meet this challenge by optimizing the nutritiousness of the foods that we produce and produce those foods in a totally sustainable fashion. Omega-3 fatty acids, in particular DHA, comes from oily fish, salmon and mackerel. But we don't have enough oily fish in the wild to feed the world's population. Devenish have produced Omega Pro, which is a poultry feed which is enriched with DHA. And by feeding Omega Pro to the chickens, you actually produce chicken meat and eggs that are enriched in DHA. This will have knock-on implications for the health and well-being of you and your family, and also for the healthcare costs and financial burden on society.
Within One Health from Soil to Society, what we're looking at is how we improve human nutrition, environmental health, and farm profitability at the same time. Carbon neutral farming, a lot of pressure is coming on us to do something about it. And what we're doing here is we're looking at how we can drive efficient beef and lamb production while measuring and managing our landscape and drive carbon sequestration to accelerate our path to net carbon zero. We created a carbon balance sheet to actually demonstrate our journey. It measures our liabilities, that's our greenhouse gas emissions. It measures our assets, the carbon in our soils, the carbon in our trees and hedges, and it allows us to work out our net position. When you know your net position, you can then decide what you do next to get that closer to carbon zero. So what we're trying to do here is drive impact, drive positive behavioral change. And we demonstrate not only the science of what our mitigation options are, but we actually do it. So here we've planted multi-species swards of legumes, that'd be clover, herbs like chicory. We're also planting trees and having cattle and trees engaging so that we can produce both food and accelerate our carbon sequestration at the same time by having this concept called silver pasture, animals and trees in the same spot simultaneously.
Heartland is a perfect example of achieving our goal of One Health from Soil to Society. It's a Marie Curie project supported by the European Commission. It's been carried out by Devenish in collaboration with University College Dublin in Ireland and Wageningen University in the Netherlands. We're looking at soil health and fertility, sward persistence, establishment of multi-species sward, its dry matter yield and its quality. We're looking at methane production in animals, we're looking at meat quality and indeed average daily weight gain. And overall then we're looking at the impact of different farm management decisions on human health and indeed environmental health. Our hope for this research is that it will have not just a local impact, but it will go well beyond the boundaries of this farm and indeed be applicable nationally and internationally.
Okay, so that's just a short video giving a little snapshot of some of the work that's going on at Devenish Nutrition's Global Innovation Centre and Research Farm at Doubt, County Meath here in Ireland. We're going to learn a lot more about that now in this part of the of this morning's webinar. Just earlier, I suppose we focused on that kind of sustainability and societal health element of the theme, and now we're going to go right back to the soil, and we're going to learn a lot more about that. So to give a presentation on some of that work, a bit more detail on the work that they're doing on the research farm at Doubt, could I introduce Dr. John Gilliland, who's Director of Global Agriculture and Sustainability at Devenish. John is a former president of the Ulster Farmers Union in Northern Ireland. He's a non-executive director of the Scottish Rural College and an energy regulator in Northern Ireland. He has been an advisor for devolved national and European governments on climate change and sustainability. And John has chaired the UK's Rural Climate Change Forum within DEFRA. He also helped set up the Carbon Management Centre in the SRUC in Edinburgh. And for the last 6 years, he's been chaired the Northern Ireland Expert Working Group on Sustainable Land Management. And he's also a member of the EU Commission's Mission Board Assembly on Soil, Health and Food in Brussels. John, over to you for a presentation on Doubt Farm and some of the work going on there.
Thank you for the opportunity today to share our journey on our towards carbon neutrality. My paper today, I'm going to talk about putting theory into practice and what we in Devenish are doing to deliver carbon neutrality. In 2013, Devenish made a big decision, and that was to actually invest in a farm of land to see, could we find solutions that would deliver carbon neutral beef and lamb by 2025, while still at the core looking to drive profitability of beef and lamb production. So in 2013, we bought the Devenish lands of Doubt in County Meath, just north of Dublin. And it is a 185 hectare grassland and wooded farm. And so over the last 7 years, we've been on a journey. And I want to share some of this journey as such. We've been looking at, key in this journey has been looking at our soils, how we improve them, looking at improving soil fertility, soil health. We've been looking at measuring carbon sequestration, about how can we do it in our trees and hedges, how can we do it in our soils. Over and above that, we've also then been looking at what we do around improving water quality, around biodiversity, because this agenda isn't just a carbon agenda. We as land managers have to deliver multiple public goods. And that includes optimizing our biodiversity, where in Doubt we've got a particular challenge, and that is we host one of the last lowland herds of wild red deer in Ireland. And we want to see a sustainable, healthy herd of red deer, but we also want to see our trees sequestering carbon. And so we have to find what is the optimal in the trade-off between a healthy herd of red deer and how we drive carbon sequestration. And if that wasn't enough, the whole farm sits within a unique landscape, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, where we have uncovered 6,000 years of continuous farming evolution. And there is nowhere better to talk about farming's future than a place where you can actually examine its past over the last 6,000 years. So when you go on a journey like this, it's very important that you can do it in a way that you can communicate your journey. To do that, we believe you need to create baselines, solid, robust baselines, and then on a regular basis, measure your performance against that. So what are we looking to do? Well, we're looking at the different greenhouse gases involved in a farming landscape. We're looking at methane from animals, we're looking for nitrous oxide from soils, we're looking at the role that the trees and soils play in sequestering carbon. And can we look at it in a way through a lens that actually creates a whole farm annual carbon balance sheet and not just look at the animals? Because we just don't manage animals. We manage the animals and the landscape that they sit within. So we want to look at the totality of our business to see, can we get to a position of net zero for greenhouse gas emissions in beef and lamb production? So in 2014, when we started this journey, the very first thing we did is we carried out a detailed GPS soil sampling and analysis to look at our fertility. And we did this on 2 hectare blocks, so really detailed. And what we found is when we bought the farm, we inherited a legacy of neglect from the previous owner. Our soil pH was awful. We have a brown earth mineral soil. It should be at a pH of 6.5. Ours was sitting at 5.5. Our potash, our phosphate wasn't much better. Also in 2014, we decided to do an aerial survey using LiDAR technology. So similar to radar technology, but this uses laser beams to actually measure our landscape. It allows us to measure our archaeology. It allows us to measure 3-dimensionally our trees and hedges. And it allows us to measure the topography of our landscape so that we can actually look at the routes of overland flow. And in doing this, we were greatly helped by Stuart Green of Teagasc, the Irish Government's Agricultural Advisory Service. And they did the analysis of our LiDAR data. We were able to work out the density of carbon in our woods, in our hedges, and surprise, surprise, hedgerows are more dense. And that comes, you can walk through a woodland, but you can't walk through a hedge. So really getting hard data about our landscape. In 2017, we decided to go to the next stage. And that was actually to measure the carbon in our soils. So although we had measured our pH, our P, our phosphate, our potash, when you go to measure carbon in soils under IPCC, you need to measure it to 30 centimeters. And we hadn't done that before. And so what we did is we dug 88 pits geographically spread over the farm. We went down to 30 centimeters. We analyzed the soil. And what we were astonished to find is the carbon in our soils was far lower than we ever expected, at 2.1%. And that really begged the question, why? Because we know our soil had, our ground had never been plowed or labored or tilled, yet we're being told by IPCC that carbon under long-term grass soils don't build any more carbon. Well, we found that there was an anomaly here. And that's the great thing about doing these baselines, is you actually uncover things you sometimes don't expect to see. So by doing all of this, we were able then to work out what were our carbon stocks in our hedges, in our trees. We were able to go to peer-reviewed publications and assume credible annual sequestration rates. And so by doing that, we could see what we were sequestering in our trees, our hedges, our soils. And in Dowth, we annually sequester approximately 665 tons of greenhouse gases, or carbon dioxide equivalents, as it's called. Now, we said from the start that we wanted to try and drive carbon neutral beef and lamb by 2025. And the one key thing, the initial thing that many people say is, well, the best way to do it is to reduce animals. So what we did here is we wanted just to sensitize our gross segregation against the gross emissions of different quantities of animals relating to stocking density. So on this bar chart, we have the total greenhouse gas emissions for Dowth on an annual basis up the y-axis. On the x-axis, we've got different stocking densities between 1 livestock unit per hectare up to 2.5 livestock units per hectare. 2 livestock units per hectare being the sweet spot under the nitrates directive. And at 1 livestock unit per hectare, on our 91 hectares of grass, we can have 91 cow-calf equivalents who will gross emissions of 580 tonnes a year. But we know our gross segregation is 665 tonnes. So at 1 livestock unit per hectare, we would actually be beyond carbon neutrality today at -76. At the other end, if we were an intensive producer, a derogated farm at 2.5 livestock units per hectare, we would be grossing 1,451 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions, less the 665 tonnes that we're sequestering, giving us a net emission of 795. At Dowth, we want to stay optimized at 2 livestock units per hectare, just below the derogation in the nitrates directive. And at that, we can have 182 animals. We would gross 1,161 tonnes, less our gross segregation of 665, giving us a net position today of 504 tonnes. So that is equivalent at Dowth, at 2 livestock units per hectare. We are currently displacing 56% of all our greenhouse gases by what we are currently sequestering in our soils, in our trees, and our hedges. And so you can see on this the difference between gross emissions and net emissions. And there's quite a difference. And that varies from farm to farm. In Dowth, our sweet spot, if we want to deliver carbon neutrality today, we could do that by dropping our stocking density to 1.25 livestock units per hectare. And we would be carbon neutral today. But our problem with that is the world still needs, in a balanced diet, livestock products. So the key for us is, can we deliver carbon neutrality at 2 livestock units per hectare? And that is what we, as a research farm, are focusing in delivering. So the very first thing we've done is we've gone back and we've looked at our soils, because what we do know is the amount of carbon that is sequestered by soil, particularly in a mineral soil, is directly related to its pH. Your soil is biological, it's living, and it sits within the living fraction of your soil. So if you drop the pH, the speed to which that biology turns over slows down, and eventually it starts to respire. And we believe that's what was happening in Dowth, and that's why our carbon levels were so low. So what we do in our soils is we measure and manage every 2 years. And you can see on this slide how we measured in 2014, we measured in 2016, 2018, and again in 2020. And in between, we've been putting small amounts of lime onto the landscape with variable rate lime spreaders. So we put lime where it's needed and not where it's not needed. And you can see over a 6-year period, we have completely transformed our soil pH. But alongside that, if I was to show you herbage yield, we very nearly doubled it because the impact of soil pH on productivity. The second thing we've done is we've tied up with internationally recognized research partners, Wageningen University and Research, University College Dublin, University of Gloucestershire, we tied up with Bord Bia, and we secured fundings through the EU's Marie Curie program to actually employ 5 PhD researchers to actually investigate the use of multi-species swards in a living lab to allow us to optimize our animal production, optimize our soil carbon sequestration, and minimize our environmental footprint. And really what we're trying to do here in co-grazing beef and lamb in a large-scale project through 36 hectares of trials, we're looking to put the data around that and put the data into the public domain of how using multi-species swards can deliver not only on accelerating your road to carbon zero, but also improving water quality, improving soil health, and delivering multiple public goods. But we don't want to stop there either, because we are very passionate that we believe that actually the way forward is not just either food production or timber production, but we are very passionate about silvopasture, putting animals and trees in the same place, of 400 to 600 trees per hectare. And we're very fortunate in Ireland that the longest term trials in Europe sit in Loughgall in County Armagh, run by the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute in Northern Ireland, and it's led for a long time by Jim McAdam. And what they've seen is over the 30 years, they have been very nearly able to treble their annual carbon sequestration through silvopasture and grazing animals simultaneously. They have dramatically improved bird numbers, beetle numbers, biodiversity. But probably most importantly for us as active farmers, by putting trees within the food producing landscape, they have also greatly improved soil trafficability. And that's a big issue for us. We live in a wet part of the world. We can grow plenty of grass and plenty of herbage, but our ground is not firm enough and dry enough to actually carry animals and carry machines. While in silvopasture, they absolutely do. And in the great drought 3 years ago in Ireland, we were able to see that silvopasture actually reduced the evapotranspiration rate, and you had farmers more resilience in drought as well in wet areas. So we believe silvopasture is another tool to put into this. At the end of the day, we've looked at landscape measures. We're also looking at the animals. And I've borrowed this slide from partners of ours in Australia, CSIRO, and they've looked at all the different mitigation options you can look at within the animal to reduce methane. And this slide is theirs, and it's a summary of the different technologies out there, their abatement potential to abate methane, and also their barriers to implementation. And you can see anything from improving genetics there, vaccinations, biochar, that's charcoal, bioactives like citrus. But you can also see algae there too. And certainly that's looking really promising, the work going on in Australia. I've seen somewhere between a 60 and a 90% reduction of methane through very small admixes in diet of asparagopsis. Right? So we believe that certainly our toolbox is becoming more full, and we believe certainly that within the next 5 to 10 years, we will have a complete box of tools that will allow us to deliver carbon neutrality, not just at Dowth, but right across the industry. As a company, Devenish is not just looking at how we improve human health by smart nutrition or how we drive towards carbon neutrality. We are very passionate, we believe, passionately about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And currently, across the breadth of what we do in Devenish, whether it's improving soils, improving human health, the work that we currently do in Africa to improve livestock production there, and the work we do in land management, we're currently delivering against 11 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. At the end of the day, I hope in this brief presentation, I've given you a glimpse of how we're putting theory into practice, how we are accelerating our journey to carbon neutrality. And we are very clear, we do believe we can get there by 2025 for BPMA. And at its core is the use of technology and education to create these robust baselines. When you do that, you get precision knowledge of each individual farmer's business. And that empowers them to make positive improvements in how they manage their farm. By building alongside that, credible measuring, reporting, and verifications of these positive changes, we can and will bring credible transparency, real change, but improved profits to not only make sure that livestock production has a future in Europe and in the world, but also to we step up to the plate and do our bit of the bargain to improve the climate that we're in. Thank you very much.
Sorry, folks, I was on mute there. Just thanks very much, John, for that really interesting presentation, giving us a snapshot of some of the excellent work that's going on at the Dowth Research Farm in County Meath. We'll be hearing more from John in the Q&A part of the section after the next presentation. And I would remind our audience that if you want to put any questions to the panel, please use the chat function on Zoom or send them via the Q&A. We are monitoring them, and we will try and get your questions to both of our panelists. Up next is Dr. Cornelia Grace. She's a multi-species sward expert who has completed a PhD in UCD in 2018, which was titled "The Potential of Multi-Species Swards Compared to Perennial Ryegrass-Only Swards for Dry Matter Yield, Chemical Consumption and Animal Performance." Dr. Grace joined Devonish in 2019 to establish and manage the Heartland Research Platform on the Dowth Farm that you've just heard from Dr. John Gilliland. Dr. Grace comes from a beef and sheep farm in Toomevara in County Tipperary, where she farms alongside her father. On the farm, a huge emphasis is put on finishing beef and lamb with good quality herbage and keeping the cost of production as low as possible. Dr. Grace, we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Cornelia Grace, and I work for Devonish at the Global Innovation Centre at the Devonish Lands at Dowth. The title of my presentation today will be the Heartland Project, a whole systems approach which we believe will deliver multiple public goods. So, as well as working for Devonish, I, like many others on this in attendance today, am a young farmer. I come from a sheep and beef farm in County Tipperary, where I farm alongside my father. I then went on to study my degree and PhD at UCD, where I was looking at the development of more sustainable grazing systems. And I suppose my job and my role now at Devonish, it has both a personal and a professional impression on me, where I believe that our goal to be carbon neutral by 2025 is very realistic, but also very inspiring as a sheep and beef farmer. So, as John kind of already explained, agriculture is often seen as the environmental pariah, but we believe that it has the potential to be an environmental asset and potentially the biggest environmental solution that we know. Our farms don't only just produce food to feed a growing population, we're also involved in water management and regulation. Our farms are huge sources of carbon storage, as well as being a biodiversity habitat. As well as this, our farms play a huge role in nutrient cycling. So we believe they're not just an environmental pariah, but the biggest environmental solution that we know. But we do have improvements to make, and we need to optimize it. So in terms of grazing and our current grazing and our grassland systems in Ireland and right across the temperate regions of Europe, they're currently dominated by perennial ryegrass monocultures. Ryegrass monocultures and ryegrass seed account for 95% of the grass seed sold in Ireland at the moment. And it's no wonder, because ryegrass crops are capable of producing high dry matter yields of excellent quality, but are heavily reliant on chemical nitrogen fertilizers, which we know have environmental impacts on water, soil, and biodiversity. So we must look for alternatives that may require less nitrogen fertilizer, but also produce high dry matter yields that we need to feed our growing livestock. So we do look at multi-species swards and how they may offer a solution. Multi-species swards are combinations of grasses, legumes, and herbs. And because of this legume component, they may require lower nitrogen inputs to produce high dry matter and high biomass production and of excellent quality, but require less nitrogen inputs. But we do know that there's a need for a whole systems approach to really look at multi-species swards as a solution. So for that reason, the Heartland Consortium was formed. Heartland is a Marie Curie funded research project, which is led by Devonish at the Devonish Lands at Dowth, with collaborators from leading universities, for example, Wageningen University in Research in the Netherlands and UCD in Dublin, in Ireland, also the University of Gloucestershire, with collaborations from Borbia and the European Food Information Council as well. Heartland is a project which brings 5 PhD students to the Devonish lands at Doubt, with their overall aim being to develop grazing systems for healthy farms to feed healthy people and contribute to a healthy environment. So we have 5 PhD students, each with studying an area from soil right through to society. So the 5 PhD students, we have one who studies all things soil related or the impact of our grazing systems on soil. A sward PhD student who looks at all things sward related. We have a data modeler who looks at modeling our systems for their ecosystem service provision. And we also have an animal science student who looks at all things animal performance. And finally, a social student who looks at the social impact of our grazing systems. These PhD students all started last year, last October, so they're full year in at this stage. And their work is centered around 2 main experiments which are ongoing at Doubt at the moment. So we have 2 large-scale experiments, and the first of these being a plot-scale experiment or plot-type experiment, where we look at the impact of 4 different sward types. So permanent pasture, which is the old sward that existed in Doubt when the farm was bought in 2013. We look at this versus a new reseeded perennial ryegrass monoculture. We also look at this compared to 2 multi-species swards, a 6-species and a 12-species sward, which contain combinations of grasses, legumes, and herbs. And we're also investigating these under 2 different sward establishment methods. So firstly, direct drill and also conventional cultivation. And we also look at different fertilizer regimes. So the use of organic and inorganic fertilizers and combinations of both. Because I suppose these are the questions we get posed from farmers, which is the most appropriate sowing method for these types of swards, and also how do they withstand the pressures of slurries and organic fertilizers. So it's a fully replicated experiment, and the variables that we'll be looking at as part of that experiment include dry matter yield and herbage quality, as well as all the inputs it takes to produce that dry matter yield. We're also looking at the carbon sequestration potential of the different sward types. We also look at the nutrient cycling of the different sward types and how that differs. We're also looking at the botanical composition and persistency around the different swards over time. We also look at earthworm and soil biodiversity within the swards and how the different sward types attract different earthworm populations and soil biodiversity, as well as the water infiltration rate from the different sward types. And the second big experiment that is ongoing at Doubt at the moment, and I suppose it's the bigger experiment, it's the systems experiment, which occupies 36 hectares of the farm at the Devonish lands at Doubt. It is looking at it investigates the impacts of 4 different sward types on animal performance. So the 4 different sward types that we're looking at are again the same as the 4 sward types in the plot type experiment. The permanent pasture, which is the old sward that existed in Doubt, which is naturally diverse, and we're fertilizing this with 135 kgs of nitrogen per hectare per year. The perennial, we're comparing this to a perennial ryegrass monoculture receiving 170 kgs of nitrogen per hectare per year. And then we're comparing these to 2 multi-species swards, a 6 and a 12 again, both receiving 70 kgs of nitrogen per hectare per year. All these sward types are co-grazed by cattle and sheep at a stocking rate of 2 livestock units per hectare. And the system that we operate for the experiment are, in terms of the sheep production system, we operate a mid-season lambing flock, lambing in mid-March. Therefore, we're synchronizing and breeding the ewes in mid-October. We have Suffolk cross ewes and we use Texel rams. Our overall aim is to draft lambs from herbage alone at approximately 45 kgs of live weight. In terms of our cattle production system, all of our cattle are sourced in the dairy herd, and they're all Angus and Hereford cross heifers. They arrive in March onto the farm at around 12 months old, and we target to finish them to reach market specification at between 18 and 12 months old during their grazing season. And the variables that we're investigating as part of that experiment are animal live weight gain and their days to slaughter. We're looking at slaughter characteristics, as well as meat quality and the sensory analysis of the meat that is produced from our systems. We're also looking at the parasitic burden of the grazing cattle and lambs. We also look at next year's grazing season, we'll be looking at the methane emissions from the different grazing seasons with the different grazing systems with the use of the green feed units. We're also looking at all the inputs each system requires and the labour input in order to do a full economic review and life cycle assessment. So then in terms of some of the preliminary results that we have found, and I guess it's important to note that this is just the first year of the experiment, and this is just the first year's data. But what we have found is we have increased the herbage grown on multi-species swards, even from the lower nitrogen inputs. So on the left-hand side of the slide that you're seeing in front of you now, it shows the overall annual tonnage produced to date, produced to the 1st of October this year. From the 4 different sward types in the systems grazing experiment. And on the right-hand side, that graph shows the daily growth rate, or daily herbage growth rate from the 4 different sward types. So just in terms of the colour schemes that the next couple of slides will have, the red bars represent the perennial ryegrass sward, the blue bars represent the permanent pasture sward, the green and the yellow bars represent the 2 multi-species sward, both the 6 and the 9 species sward. And that colour scheme will follow the presentation throughout. So for example, from the first graph, it's clear to see that the 2 multi-species swards outperformed the other 2 swards despite receiving only 70 kgs of nitrogen. And I suppose as a farmer, the slide on the right-hand side really interests me because like many areas of the world, in this year, between the months of mid-March to mid-June, Dowd experienced drought conditions. And what we noticed in those drought conditions were that the multi-species swards were growing at about 75 kgs of dry matter per hectare per day, when the other 2 swards completely slowed down and were growing at between 20 and 25 kgs of dry matter per hectare per day. So I suppose as droughts happen more and more often, we believe the use of multi-species swards may provide on-farm resilience to drought, which is becoming more and more important as droughts happen more and more often. So then, just to give a brief look at the animal performance, and I suppose sheep performance in particular, these 2 graphs, the one on the left shows lamb weaning weight this year, and the one on the right shows yolk body condition score this year. So I suppose what we have found is that lambs on the 2 multi-species swards weaned a lot heavier than the lambs on the other 2 swards, and as a result were drafted for slaughter approximately 5 weeks before the lambs on the other 2 swards. So the lambs on the multi-species swards drafting to slaughter about 5 weeks before the lambs on the other 2 swards. As well as this, a similar trend is seen when we look at body condition score. So the ewes on the 2 multi-species swards were constantly throughout the whole grazing season in better body condition score than the ewes on the other 2 sward types. And I suppose this could be as a result of the earlier drafting of the lambs on those swards, that the ewes had more time to concentrate on themselves and put on that condition that they required. So as well as all these agricultural production targets that we achieved or results that we found, we've seen a huge number of co-benefits of having the multi-species swards within our grazing platform as well. So for example, we saw a huge increase in insect life this year, which never went unnoticed by any of the visitors that we had to Dowd this year. And as a result of this, we've seen a huge increase in the wildlife around the farm. For example, if you look closely at the picture on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a field mouse nesting in the multi-species swards. As well as in the middle picture, you'll see a hare also needing rescuing from the multi-species swards just before we cut. But I guess what we've really noticed is because of this available cover and insect life, we've seen a lot more of that wildlife attracted to the farm. And then I'll bring your attention to the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. This picture is of grey partridges, which were almost extinct in Ireland back in the 1990s, with only about 20 breeding birds around the country. But through a breeding programme, that number has now increased. And in the last couple of months, we have become home to 20 breeding grey partridges in Dowd, because now more than ever, we have this increased insect life, as well as a cover that they can now use to hide from their prey. And we've introduced them back into the farm. And one more other benefit that we have seen through to the multi-species sward is improved soil structure. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you'll see the soil structure underneath a perennial ryegrass sward. Compared to on the right-hand side, you'll see the soil structure underneath a multi-species sward. And you can see the huge improvement that the multi-species swards have brought to the soil structure. And I suppose this is as a result to the differing root architecture that the multi-species brings to a sward. And as a result of this improved sward structure, and I suppose the increased insect activity around the multi-species swards, we've seen a huge increase in earthworm activity underneath the multi-species sward, a 3-fold increase in earthworm abundance underneath the multi-species sward compared to the perennial ryegrass only sward. So we believe that agriculture can deliver multiple public goods, and I hope my presentation has highlighted that, and also that we can be part of the solution. So just before I finish up, this work that I've presented would not be possible without the help of all the people listed on this graph or this slide, and many, many more. So thank you very much to all these people for your ongoing support and help for the Heartland Project. And I also thank you for your attention and for the invitation to speak here today. If you are interested in keeping up to date with the Heartland findings and activities, please follow us on Twitter or check out our website, heartlandproject.eu. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions that you may have around this topic.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. That's a really, really interesting presentation. Okay, folks, we're going to go into a panel discussion now with Dr. Gilliland and Dr. Cornelia Grace. Please send in your questions to us and we'll try and get them to them. Cornelia, if I could start with you, like, that's a really interesting presentation. What you're doing there and showing through the Heartland Project is you're delivering a huge amount of benefits. You're delivering a really high quality food product. You're delivering environmental benefits through the multi-species swards and the need for less nitrogen and inputs, and then the biodiversity wins that you're also seeing there. I mean, it's fantastic. But what strikes me as well, there's complexity as well, and you have the benefit of 5 PhD students and a team around people and a lot of knowledge there. How do we translate the knowledge and the research you're producing in Heartland to the average farmer in Ireland or in Europe?
Well, I guess it obviously is not going to happen straight away. So I couldn't imagine any farmer is going to go 100% into multi-species in 1 year or in 2 years or even in 3 or 5 years. But I guess it is very possible, and starting with maybe reseeding or incorporating multi-species swards into part of your platform over a long period of time would not be a very hard thing to do, especially if you already have a reseeding program.
Mm-hmm. And just a question that came in from one of our listeners, Cornelia, was just about the work you're doing there. Have you been able to observe any impact it's had on bird life kind of around the farm, even anecdotally?
Yeah, I suppose we're not necessarily measuring bird life increases, but we have noticed that, and every visitor that's come to the farm has noticed that too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. John, coming to you in terms of there's a lot of work going on at that farm, and some of the stuff you're doing in terms of carbon sequestration measurement, like, it's really groundbreaking stuff, I think. Obviously, we have an EU audience here listening to us this morning, and that's very much an Irish example of farming. But do you think this is something we should be looking at broader, in more broad terms, than European-wide agriculture, in terms of the carbon sequestration impact of our farms? And how do you think that could be rolled out, scaled, some of the work you're doing there?
Well, thank you. And yes, I do. And I've been privileged to be part of the EU Soil Health and Food Mission Board, where we published a roadmap about how we would look to see this rolled out. And it's helped by the fact that the Commission in their 2030 targets is recognising that farming can do good as well as create emissions as such. So I think the super tanker we're on around greenhouse gas emissions and farms, I think is turning, and I think there is now recognition that we have a role to play. The key thing that we have done in Dowth is bring transparency to our journey. We instill the discipline, is we measure, we create baselines, we then record our management decisions, and then we go back and measure again. And you know, there are many people making many assumptions, but really what we're doing is by bringing this discipline, is that we then show our positive change in a way that's independently verifiable. And it's really important that consumers, that regulators, policymakers, all know that the journey that we're on is that we can actually deliver both nutritious food and a food production system that is far more environmentally benign and is independently verifiable, so they have confidence that actually we're delivering what we're saying.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. John, something me and you have talked about before is terms of the carbon balance sheet approach, or the net carbon approach, as you've done on the farm in Dowth, is that ability to empower farmers to take climate action, that they can see that they're actually making a difference rather than feeling that what they do for a living is actually having a negative impact. Whereas what you're doing is trying to encourage the positives they can contribute. Where have we gone wrong in that so far? Where can we do better, do you think, in terms of future policy or things that we can get farmers to do to feel empowered that they're making a positive contribution on climate?
Well, I think probably the success that we're having is because of a previous experience I learned when I was an energy regulator. When I was an energy regulator in Northern Ireland, we took the power stations of Northern Ireland into the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And we didn't take their gross emissions in, we took their net emissions. So if you had a power plant operator who had both coal-fired power stations and wind turbines, it was the net difference. And that really, I want to see, could we translate that into agriculture? Because for the last 20 years, we've been focusing on emissions and mitigating emissions. And so that gives all the reports that are published today are on our gross emissions. But they don't recognize that the same farmer who has dairy animals or beef and lamb animals is also managing the environment to which those animals graze and eat and live. And so this concept of actually going from gross emissions, then working on gross sequestration to get your net position, brings great transparency, and it allows then the farmer to use every tool in their toolbox and not just part of the toolbox. And the idea of the balance sheet then was as a communication tool to actually be able then to visualize our journey, to communicate that journey, and to see how it changes over time. And I really hope, and this is a European audience, that one of the key take-home messages is it's now time that we started to measure farmers on net emissions, not gross emissions. And by doing that alone, it empowers this journey to look at how we mitigate better, how we sequester better, and by doing both simultaneously, we accelerate our journey to net zero.
Mm-hmm. Cornelia, if I could come back to you, just, you know, the work you're doing on multi-species sward, it's a new concept that's gaining a lot and more traction by the month, I would say, nearly in Ireland, in terms of farmers are becoming increasingly interested in it as a new technique to farm with. Just give us a bit more sense of some of the findings. I mean, I think you've had a very good year in terms of some of the results you're seeing from animal performance is very good. And also, can you give us an idea of some, from an input level in terms of nitrogen use, what sort of reductions are you seeing in terms of yield and what you're able to get there?
So the yields that I presented our yields to the 1st of October. Mm-hmm. At that point, we had the multi-species swards had received 70 kgs of nitrogen per hectare per year, and that was our total application for the year. But we did produce 30% more herbage from that sward compared to the ryegrass monoculture that received 170 kgs. Mm-hmm. I Our initial plan was to apply about 90 kgs of nitrogen to that multi-species swards, but we changed our minds kind of coming to in the middle of August there, when we were planning on putting out the last 20 kg, because at that point we had harvested more than required amount of silage. We had more than enough herbage available ahead of our stock, and our drafting had been so much quicker on the two multi-species swards that our stocking rate had gotten quite low at that stage. So we cut the nitrogen input to 70, and we'll make the same decision to do the same thing again next year.
Okay, so it allowed you to make that decision to actually reduce your inputs for the year, and because you're ahead of yourselves. And just something maybe that's interesting, I think, from you know, our permanent pastures here in Ireland. You guys did some good, interesting research on the amount of species in those kind of permanent pastures that have been untouched really for decades. They're quite diverse compared to kind of seeded perennial ryegrass monocultures.
Yeah, for sure. So at every grazing, we do botanical separation on the multi-species swards, but as well as that, we do a botanical separation on the permanent pastures. And we have found up to 28 different species in the permanent pastures throughout the year. So some of those are desirable species, then some of them are the more undesirables. But I guess, yeah, 28 different species in one sward, completely unsown, unrejuvenated. Some very old species, hard to recognise when you're doing a botanical composition, I must admit. But our PhD student, Jane Shackleton, has become an expert at this stage at the botanical composition and identifying the different species types within the sward.
It's interesting. So nature is almost providing with. Go ahead, John.
No, if I can just add a supplementary there. I mean, the thing that has been extraordinary about the permanent pastures is when we bought the farm in 2013, our annual yield from our permanent pasture was down about 4.5-5 dry ton per hectare. What is very interesting is the journey that we've been on by correcting some of our soil problems, is that we very nearly doubled our annual yield of grass from that, not by reseeding, but just getting our pH right, getting our soil biology right. And it really gave me considerable heart that when you actually look at the performance of the 4 different sward types, the long-term permanent pasture is the one that you thought would always be last. Well, it is last, but it's not last by the significant gap that you thought it would have been. And I always say to people, when we're going on this journey, number one, before you do anything about reseeding, please go and get your soils right. You get your soils right, then the world is your oyster. And I would not like to do a multi-species sward on mineral soils of low pH. Legumes need, a proper, they need 6.5 of pH. And we need to look at our soils as well as our swards.
Okay. And with that, John, I mean, like, as from both of your presentations there's clearly an awful lot of work been done and new research uncovered. A good question here from one of our viewers, what kind of outreach activities are you doing to engage with young farmers or farmers in general to try and, spread some of this knowledge that you're uncovering?
Well, I'm going to let Connie, because poor Connie has to field most of them. I mean, up until COVID, would be fair, we were probably having about 50 groups of visitors a year through Dowth. Since COVID, I sadly are less there, and poor Connie has to carry the burden on her shoulders and in a COVID secure way as such. But it would be fair to say the interest that's coming internationally for what we're doing is quite extraordinary. And I've been privileged to have participate in several forums with CIGA. Participate in a very constructive forum this time last year called Clymakers in Brussels. And certainly that had spiraled. And so it's not just a local interest we have, it is an international interest. And Dowth being part of the global network on Lighthouse Farms, 3 of that network were singled out and used by the European Commission, used by EIP Agri 2 weeks ago as exemplars of best practice of change. So we do it both at a local level, European level, and at an international level.
Okay. Cornelia, maybe one for you, a question from one of our viewers, Ashton Caroline. She asks, do you have any info in terms of the profitability of the farm? Obviously, you're doing a lot of work there, but is it profitable? Is it from a farming system perspective?
Yeah, I suppose to establish multi-species swards, it's slightly more expensive when you look at it in the grand scheme, like when you're comparing it to just one species sward. But it's just the seed mix that's just a little bit more expensive now. But I guess when you take into account the reduction in nitrogen fertilizer that we're seeing, as well as the increase in animal performance, I would imagine, although the economic review isn't completed yet, but it will be completed for each year, I would imagine that the multi-species swards will compare a little bit more more favorably than the perennial ryegrass monoculture as a result of the reduction in nitrogen input, as well as the fact that animals are slaughtered a lot quicker. So, for example, you're getting lambs off the farm a lot quicker. Therefore, you're able to, use that extra herbage that's available then when the lambs are gone to better feed your other stock, like your cattle or your ewes, but also you could end up making more silage and selling it, or introduce an extra stock if you really wanted to do it that way. But I guess in our system, we haven't completed the full economic review, but definitely I would imagine it's looking very favourably towards the multi-species swards for the increase in health benefits as well, and animal performance, as well as increase in herbage and lower inputs, I guess. We will see when the full economic review is done after the 4 years, but yeah, I think it would look favourably towards the multi-species swards.
Okay, well, it'll be interesting results when they do come out. Maybe in keeping with that, John, I mean, the idea of being able to sell silage off the farm. One question, I suppose, in this week's Farmers Journal, we've a report on the Clover project, which has kind of been sort of put together an idea by the industry over the last number of years about, biogas, renewable energy coming off farms. What's your view on that, John, in terms of a new option or income stream potential for farms in Europe?
Well, I have to say, I'm delighted to see Project Clover getting off the ground. And I'm going to say, and I see it not only as a next income stream for farmers. We are a net exporter of food. We are driving, Dowth is a classic example of driving towards net zero. There's no point farms delivering net zero if the processors who process our product coming off our farms are not also going down that route. And it makes an awful lot of sense that actually they reach to the farmers to supply their raw material for food to process, that they also reach the farmers to provide the raw material to drive their energy needs and to drop carbon. Because ultimately, we don't need just carbon neutral farming, we need carbon neutral food. And so the connecting of food processing, primary production, and looking at minimizing our carbon footprint on the food and on the energy, so that anything that leaves the island of Ireland is as close to net zero as possible. Because at the end, we don't have any other choice. We produce a lot of herbage here. We need animals to graze it. We can't plough every acre of land in Ireland. And neither environmentally do we want to do that, even if that was the way we went. So our answer, and Alice made it very clear at the start, the reason Eat Lancet came out against red meat wasn't about the health benefits. It was because we are seen to be carbon intense in our food. So our challenge is we brought the carbon intensity. We can answer that criticism, but we can produce a neutrally dense food in a way that has taken the carbon footprint out of the farming, out of the food processing, in a circular economy way. So from Devenish's point of view, we are fully supportive of Project Clover.
Okay, and so well, obviously as well, a carbon neutral food, there's obviously there's a marketing opportunity in that as well. Cornelia, I'm going to put a point to you. As I said, a lot of interest from farmers about multi-species swords and how they can be used going forward. Just a question that came in, what are you seeing in terms of the persistency of the sword and the kind of quality in terms of getting it established? Have you found issues there, or where is that?
Yeah, so persistency is one of the big questions, these species swords for sure. And we are doing a lot of work around designing, I suppose, a management system that most appropriately, deals with that persistency issue. So our management system is a little bit different. We are grazing the multi-species swords at heavier covers than you would normally see for a ryegrass sword. And we're also not grazing them as tightly as you would a ryegrass sword. So for my own PhD at UCD, I looked at managing the multi-species swords exactly like you'd manage ryegrass. So going in at pre-grazing covers of 1,500 kg dry matter per hectare and grazing to 4 centimetres. And I suppose what we did see was a decline in the persistency of things like the clovers and the red clover in particular, and the chicory. So what we have developed at Dowt is a different approach. So we're grazing heavier covers and grazing them to 6 centimetres as opposed to 4, in the hope that that will improve the longevity of our swords for the next couple of years. But I suppose Heartland is a 4-year project, and we hope to examine the longevity of those swords over 4 years in a bid to improve the persistency of those species, because I suppose they are key to the performance results that we're seeing. The deep rooting species are key to the drought resistance and the increase in dry matter yields, as well as the animal performance benefits. So we have to make sure that they survive long enough in our swords to be viable. So we believe our approach to management will improve the longevity of the sword. And then in terms of establishment, I suppose we have had 2 different approaches. We established some of the swords for the big experiment. We established all of them in the summertime, so in June time. But we established our small plots in the autumn, and we realised that the autumn is probably not the best approach. I would say that we got a very wet autumn the year we established those, and had to re-establish the following spring summer. So I guess my advice would be around opting for summer or very early autumn. Spring, summer, or very early autumn establishment of the multi-species swords. So I suppose they really need long days and warmer soil temperatures to really get them going. So they're the 2 big findings that we've seen. I suppose we're managing them a small bit differently than we have been in the past, and we're also advising, I suppose, from our own experience, to sow in, say, the late spring, summer, or early autumn at the latest, to get a really good establishment of them, just because you need those long days and warmer temperatures for optimum, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much, Cornelia. Look, we're running a little bit over time, folks, so I'm going to wrap up this second session here now. Thank you very much to Dr. John Gilliland and Dr. Cornelia Grace. I would say to all our viewers, if you haven't been, try and get to the Dowt research farm. It is one of the most interesting places you will ever visit as a farmer, and you will leave it with lots of ideas in your head going forward. So thanks to both for that. We're going to move for a final closing statement from Yanis Mais, who's the president of CIJA. Yanis, over to you for closing remarks.
Thank you, Lorcan, for that, and let me start by thanking all of our partners and organizers, in particular Macra na Firma, our Irish young farmers, Devenish for all the contributions, also the Lighthouse Network at Wageningen University, our own CIJA office, and Traction who provided the technical support. On top of that, obviously, Lorcan, also you and all the speakers, I want to thank you for a thought-provoking a few hours that we just witnessed. In conclusion, let me maybe go back to the very beginning, where Thomas Duffy, president of Macra na Firma, said something very important: diversity. Diversity is what defines our European agricultural model, and it is through its diversity that we also believe we will be able to tackle a diversity of challenges that we are facing, whether it is a diversity of environmental challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on, or whether it is, still importantly, food security, whether it is economic value for farmers and rural communities. And it is the diversity of food production systems that all of us are engaged in which need to be established and acknowledged in the role that they can play. The subtitle of this very webinar was From Soil to Society. And it does indeed reiterate the importance of soil and access to land for young farmers to be able to play an active role in making our food systems more sustainable. In that sense, it cannot be overestimated how important the question of access to land is and remains, together with the generational renewal question which is out there. And policy framers must not only acknowledge that question, but they must fully imply every single instrument which is available to them to ensure that that question can also be solved. Otherwise, we cannot be expected in the coming 20, 30 years as farmers to play our role, which we must also try and play. And in that sense, the Farm to Fork strategy as presented has clearly not been up to the task. And so the future must be better from a policy perspective. We had quite a discussion on meat, and it is always a sensitive topic, obviously, when you are in a room of farmers and you want to start some activity in the room. Well, mention meat, and you'll have a lot of debate going up and forth. And I think maybe one of the most important conclusions from the presentations we received today is that obviously also our meat producers and the meat factor in our food systems have the ambition and must show the ambition to improve their production systems, to become even more efficient, to increase our environmental performance while producing. But we can do that without feeling criminalized for the productions that we have, because also our meat producers do contribute to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals put forward by the United Nations, and they should also be acknowledged in that. A much more important question when it comes to meat and the whole debate around meat is that however our diets will evolve in the coming years and decades, we have to make sure that farmers and farming communities can finally receive a fair share of added value within every production system that they play a role. Because even if we go to a more plant-based diet, also there it will be farmers who are at the very foundation of that diet. And so NGOs, politicians, and civil society in a whole must do a real reflection on what kind of food system that they want. We are very clear that also in the future, whatever the diet might be, the food system must be built on a foundation of family farms across Europe. And I hope that we will not go into a push towards a handful of multinationals going to form the food systems of the future. Labeling and consumer information in that sense will be a crucial element. We have to make sure that consumers are empowered to take the responsibility for the consumption patterns that they will take in the future. But labeling can only be useful and can only be acceptable for that matter if they are science-based and based on portions of consumption rather than just raw grams. Lastly, and there was a point that John mentioned at the very end of this webinar, and a crucial point, the relation between the farming sector and climate change in the view of European young farmers is threefold. We are first and foremost the first victim of climate change, a climate which is already changing today. On top of that, we have indeed, just like any other human activity, just like any other economic sector, the responsibility to lower our own emissions and to make our productions more efficient in the future. But lastly and crucially, we are one of the only players who can also have a positive impact on the climate. And we should be acknowledged for that positive impact in order to inspire farmers to do their part. The showcases that we have seen today clearly show that we can have that positive impact, but we should be acknowledged and empowered to do so via civil support mechanisms. And lastly, and let me conclude with that before wishing you all an enjoyable lunch this noon. Let this webinar be the very starting point of a broader reflection. Next year, there is the UN Food Systems Summit, and that summit will be crucial to define the big ambitions of global society on how to establish more sustainable food systems. And such a debate cannot be happening without farmers and young farmers in particular around the table. So make sure that our generation is around that table and that we are co-constructing the food systems of tomorrow. I wish you all a good lunch, a good appetite, and thank you to all for joining in.
Thank you very much, Yannis, for those closing remarks. And with that, I will draw to a close this morning's webinar, One Health from Soil to Society. I think it was a really engaging discussion. So thank you to all our speakers and contributors, and thank you to you for tuning in for this morning's webinar. And thank you, bye.